Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us today for this special conversation. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Oge Onoborgo, and I'm the director of the Africa program here, where through our research and convening, we work to address some of the most critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations. And that is why today we're especially honored to host this conversation on African sovereign wealth funds, which is part of our broader discussions with Brown Capital Management. Brown Capital Management Africa Forum series. We're really delighted to have this conversation today and to have our speakers who will be joining us today, who I'll introduce later. Unfortunately, one of our speakers is stuck in transit due to the bad weather that we experienced yesterday. So we're hoping that he will be able to join us during the conversation. We're hoping he will be here during the conversation. And so with that, allow me to turn it over to the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green, to give some welcome remarks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Oge, and I will be brief, but building on what Oge said, we want to welcome all of you here. The Wilson Center, as you may know, is a unique institution in foreign policy. We're congressionally chartered, we're scholarship-driven, and as I like to say, we are fiercely independent and nonpartisan. That charter, I think, not only creates special opportunities for us, but special obligations. So I tell the team each and every day, we should not duplicate what others are doing. If they're doing good work, God bless them, let's reinforce it. Instead, we should look for those openings. We should look for those priorities. We should look for those topics and areas that we believe can present important opportunities and ways for us to add value. And that's exactly why our partnership with Brown Capital Management is so very important. Brown Capital Management has been really a leader in thinking about opportunities in Africa. As many of you know, I'm an Africa guy by training and outlook. I spent much of my career in foreign policy working on opportunities in Africa. And I think we all agree that the great frustration is that not enough people see Africa for what it is, a land of opportunity. We don't mean to be, but we are softly patronizing. We think of the African continent as being hopeless and helpless, as opposed to what it is, an emerging part of global leadership. This is Africa's time. The youngest continent, not only a ready source of labor, but a ready source of ideas and inspiration and private enterprise-driven solutions. That's why the Brown Capital Management Forum is so very important, because we explore these issues. We explore issues of investment. We explore issues of economic opportunity, from trade to what we're here to talk about today, the role of sovereign wealth funds in Africa's future economic development. So I wanted to make sure that I took this opportunity to thank Brown Capital Management. We are grateful to Mr. Eddie Brown, Mrs. Sylvia Brown, Mr. Keith Lee, and current President Robert Young III. Without their support, we would not be able to do this critical work. We would not be able to take up these opportunities. We're also excited to have with us here today as one of the panelists, Dr. Patrick Utomi. He is the new Brown Capital Management Africa Program Public Policy Fellow here at Wilson. And he will be spending the next 12 months with us driving our work on African sovereign wealth funds. It is now my distinct honor and pleasure to turn the floor over to someone who is no stranger to the Wilson Center, Mike Forster, the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer of Brown Capital Management. He is well known to everyone here at Wilson, led us in so many ways for so long. Today he's playing a different role, representing Brown Capital Management. And again, Mike, I want to turn things over to you, but thank you for all that you've done for Wilson, and now in this new role, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ambassador Green. On behalf of founder and executive chairman Eddie Brown, CEO Keith Lee, and the entire Brown Capital enterprise, I want to thank all who have joined us in person and online for today's event, Sovereign Wealth Funds and Infrastructure Development in Africa. As mentioned, this program is the relaunch of the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum. I also would like to thank the Wilson Center Africa Program for their support in organizing and hosting today's event. As Ambassador Green mentioned, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum is a platform for substantive, policy-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and sustainable development issues in Africa. Brown Capital Management is proud to support and partner with the Wilson Center to shine the spotlight on Africa's development, the challenges as well as the opportunities, and the potential for stronger and mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa economic engagement. The Africa Forum has been committed to Africa's economic development and U.S.-Africa economic relations for the past 8 years. The forum has dedicated itself to unpacking the drivers of Africa's ongoing transformation. It has examined various factors like the role of the business sector in peace building, the implications of changing global trade architectures, and supply chain challenges, and the ways to maximize the participation of women in economic leadership. The forum has continued to be a crucial platform for experts to find actionable solutions to bolster sustainable development and build mutually beneficial trade and investment relations between Africa and the United States. By 2050, Africa's population will almost double with 2.5 billion people. Adequate infrastructure services are needed to keep up with the rapid growth in population. Investing in infrastructure projects in Africa, especially at the city level, will require significant social and financial investments and additional sources of financing to meet the funding gap. The Brown Capital Management Africa Forum understands that African sovereign wealth funds have the potential to contribute meaningfully towards financing infrastructure and fostering economic growth. We have renewed our commitment to further work on the African Sovereign Wealth Fund series through the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum here at the Wilson Center. The forum continues to be the premier platform focused on the needs, challenges, successes, and priorities of African funds. For that reason, it is a recognized source of analysis on African sovereign wealth funds and a trusted partner for government and fund managers to network and share peer learning experiences and lessons. I'm so excited to hear from our speakers today who will share their insights and their experiences on how sovereign wealth funds have been utilized in driving infrastructure development in Africa. I'm also excited to be home. I now turn it over to Oge.
Thank you so much, Keith. Really appreciate the support from Brown Capital Management. And I would like to introduce Dr. Patrick Utomi, who will be with us for the next 12 months as our Brown Capital Management Africa Program Public Policy Fellow, really driving our work on deepening our understanding on African sovereign wealth funds, especially on the tool and the role it can play at the subnational level across the continent. A brief bio on Dr. Utomi, who, for many who follow the the political economy scene in Nigeria or in Africa, he's no stranger to many individuals. Dr. Patitomi is a recognized Nigerian political economist and management expert. He's a senior fellow of the Institute of Management Consultants of Nigeria and also a former presidential candidate in Nigeria. He has served in public offices, at the highest levels in public offices in the private sector, as well as in academia. Served in senior positions in government, where he served as an advisor to the president of Nigeria, and in the private sector, where he was the first chief operating officer of Volkswagen Nigeria. He is a founder of the Center for Values and Leadership, a social enterprise organization dedicated to empowering Nigerians to make lasting contributions in areas of business, public life, and civil society. Dr. Otome is also the chair, actually the first chair, of the African Union's Pan-African Private Sector Trade and Investment Committee, PAFTRAC. PAFTRAC is a unique advocacy platform supported by the Afri-Exim Bank that brings together African private sector and African policymakers to support extra and intra-African trade, investment, and enterprise. Dr. Otome, we are delighted you've joined us here today for this conversation, and equally delighted that you will be spending a year with us here at the Wilson Center.
I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you so much. So we're going to dive right into the conversation. And as I mentioned, for those who are just joining us now, our second speaker is stuck in transit and should be joining us towards the end of this conversation, hopefully. Prof, so you currently serve as the chair of PAFTRAC, in fact, the first chair of PAFTRAC. And as I mentioned, this is a unique platform, a unique advocacy platform. We haven't seen something like this on the continent before. And it seeks to bring African private sector and African policy makers together to support intra-African trade. Do you see sovereign wealth funds, or what place or what role do you see sovereign wealth funds playing in a network or a platform like this?
Well, thank you so very much. I am actually not the first chair. I'm the first active chair.
First acting chair, sorry.
There's some history to this. Babacar Ndiaye was president of the African Development Bank, and I had some collaboration with him in the creation of the Africa Business Roundtable. For some reason, that effort to bring private enterprise together with the work of the African Development Bank to drive policy choice on the continent didn't quite work out as Ndiaye intended it. So the Afri-Exim Bank took the initiative of creating an alternative platform. Again, I got roped into it, and the former president of the African Development Bank, William Mugomba, was elected the first chair, but he couldn't get going before he passed. So I was then appointed chairman of PAFTRAC. But PAFTRAC seeks to play a very important role because, as you mentioned in your early comment, we tend to act in silos. We have people from the public sector who go to meetings and sign agreements that will be implemented by private sector people without consulting private sector people at all. And so we have a chaotic policy arena. And so to kind of bring some order, the leadership of the multilateral agencies in Africa thought that there was the need to get a private sector which could help make input into choice by African heads of state that can drive development on the continent. And so in that role, I have been associated with the survey that PAFTRAC carries out of the African private sector to look at what challenges Africa the most and how the private sector can stimulate counsel to political leaders in making choices that will facilitate growth and development. In the area of sovereign wealth funds, what PAFTRAC has tried to focus attention on is the fact that we tend to overly look at central government, whereas subnationals are closer to the people, feel the pain and the needs a lot more, and that some attention to subnationals can truly do more for savings and growth. Now, there are a couple of African countries that have quite interesting experiences with how this has evolved, the trajectory. I can give examples from several parts. Maybe I'll take Nigeria and Botswana as perhaps contrasting examples. Many people forget that Botswana, between 1968 and 1980, was probably the fastest growing economy in the world, driven essentially by diamond exports. But Botswana had the good thinking to recognize that that natural resource belongs to all generation of Botswanans, those alive today and those who will be born in 200-300 years. And so their strategy was to essentially create a future fund and save a significant part of this. And the Pula Fund, as most of us have come to know it, has been really the mother sovereign wealth fund on the continent of Africa. In Nigeria, we've traveled a slightly different track. Well, first of all, what I like to call a dangerous alchemy of a convergence of soldiers and oil led to, if you will, a centralization of decision-making in a way that's different from the start of the country as a federation. When Nigeria started out as a federation, most of the development was driven from the subnational level. And in fact, there was competition between the subnationals on who would most bring progress to the people. Someone who this center knows very well was a big part of this center, Howard Wolpe. Howard Wolpe wrote a book with a colleague back in the 1970s on modernization in Nigeria. And they essentially, Robert Melson and Wolpe tried to make the point that there was an ethnocentric view of, say, the Nigerian Civil War as warlords, tribal. But essentially what was going on in Nigeria was nationality groups were competing one with the other about who would most bring progress to their people. And they call this phenomenon competitive communalism. And this phenomenon was responsible for the dramatic growth between 1956-57, when self-government came to Nigeria, and the mid-60s. Now, when soldiers came in 66, a natural tendency from the nature of military led to a kind of centralizing of authority. And oil becoming now a major factor led to the soldiers really feeling that they didn't have to account to anybody. And this led to a prebendal culture, as Richard Joseph writes about. This prebendal culture, where the center basically hands out prebends to the subnationals, led to the subnationals forgetting their traditional role as the primary drivers of development. And this has hurt Nigeria quite a bit in terms of growth. Mm-hmm. So the experiences of Nigeria and Botswana contrast significantly, and we can talk some more about all of this.
So why don't I pick it up from there as well, where some will see that there might be a challenge, or there is a challenge when it comes to a perceived challenge on the continent when it comes to raising capital investment for infrastructure. Do you see this changing? Has it changed over time? You've gone back in history. You've looked at what has happened in Nigeria over time and several other countries. But do you see things changing on the continent in terms of mobilizing investment for infrastructure from within?
Right. In some sense, there's been a weakening of the approach to infrastructure development on the continent, in my view. back in the 50s, there was an economist at Columbia, Ragnar Knoxe, who became quite famous for his mantra, capital is made at home. There's a tendency, I think, in the evolution of post-colonial Africa that the sense of we're too weak to provide infrastructure. Capital should come from elsewhere to provide infrastructure. Spoiled an understanding of how, if you will, national savings can drive infrastructure. Of course, capital can come from elsewhere, but it's easier when that capital piggybacks on, domestic capital. And then the more important challenge is the risking, the environment, the engagement of foreign capital, because there's a perception from outside of risk that may not match reality, and somebody needs to intervene in that regard. Here, Afreximbank has particularly tried to play a role. It's probably invested more than, or lent around investments, more than $60 billion in infrastructure development across the continent. But its primary role is to facilitate investors from outside becoming more comfortable with Africa risk. And I think that sovereign wealth funds have come to be a useful tool in that regard if they are properly managed. Because the big challenge with sovereign wealth funds is that you cannot be certain how the politics will play out and how successor governments manage sovereign wealth funds. And that's why governance is so important in this arena. I'm really sorry that Peter Obi is unable to be with us at this point, because one of the points I'd like to make about his tenure, when Peter Obi was elected governor of Anambra State, they could hardly pay salaries. I mean, the schools had been shut for like 2 years, and so on and so forth. And within a few years, he was able to get to a point where he saved billions of naira. Not only did he begin to do all those other things, salaries, but he saved significant amounts of money, created a basic subnational sovereign wealth fund. Sadly, and maybe he would have explained that better if he was here, that money disappeared very quickly after he stopped being governor. And this is why governance is really so important with these funds.
So let's pull on that string on the Anambra example that you've laid out, because we really want to look at, sovereign wealth funds as a tool to drive infrastructure development at the subnational level, not only across the continent, really. Subnationals at the city level, at the village level, these are the closest, and they have the most immediate impact on the daily lives of citizens on the continent. When we also look across the numbers and just in terms of population growth, 10 of the world's fastest growing urban centers are going to be on the African continent. So increasingly, we will want to see the subnational levels playing a much better role in trying to ensure that they can drive or access investments in infrastructure, in developing infrastructure. And then when we also look, as we had discussed earlier, the new U.S. strategy towards Africa also calls for a rebalancing towards urban hubs. And as we saw last week with the visit of the Kenyan president, we also saw, sort of the signing of the agreement between the MCC and the Kenyan government to focus on Nairobi, an urban revitalization program in the city of Nairobi. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on how subnationals could play this role, coming from the Anambra example, because this is not something typically that a lot of subnationals engage with. How can they effectively access this space now to think about sovereign wealth funds, be it funds for stabilizations or savings or thinking about the future, or in this case, investment in infrastructure development?
Yeah, I think this is really, really a very important watershed point that we are going through. Not only does the Anambra example show us something, but the call for decentralization in the structure of politics in Africa. I think generally in Nigeria, there's a lot of talk about it, but once people capture the center as it is, because state capture is a big part of the challenge of politics in post-colonial Africa, even when they were advocates of decentralization, they become less enamored of moving quickly down that track. But we see that in spite of that tendency, subnationals are becoming more sensitive. Just 2 weeks ago, the government of Nasarawa State in Nigeria held its investment summit. And one of the things that the governor talked about was that they were going to be saving a certain amount of money. Nasarawa State is interestingly a state that has come to a lot of, if you will, new sense of itself because so many mineral deposits have been discovered there. They just built, with some foreign partners, a lithium processing plant, because there's a huge lithium deposit in Nasarawa State. And other mineral deposits. Now, even crude oil has been found in very significant portions in Nasarawa State. And I actually had a conversation with the governor about a deliberate policy to try and save whatever is coming to Nasarawa. And I should tell you, by the way, I've taken advantage to invite him to come to the Woodrow Wilson Center in July for the conference that we are talking about, and he has said he will come. And so he can speak to how he's trying to get this done in Nasarawa State. And I think that with this new kind of thinking, if that competitive mindset that Wolpe and Melson had talked about begins to return to how subnationals engage, we may see stronger subnational sovereign wealth funds. And then another point about cities, strong cities. Paul Collier is the Oxford economist who has run the Center for African Economies for decades. Paul Collier has begun to focus in the last couple of years on ocean-facing cities and the opportunities that are. And in 2017, he gave a talk in Lagos about this. The Lagos state governor was sitting there and really got animated and invited him back a few months afterwards to speak more to that. Of course, because there's a challenge of continuity, he had developed a big initiative around Collier's thoughts on that. Lagos as an ocean-facing city. His successors may not have picked up on those ideas, but enough of these ideas are coming to people who are getting into leadership positions at those subnational levels that I think we're going to see a lot more activity. Now, if they have help, and this is where Afri-Exim Bank is trying to create a base for providing this help. They have, for example, worked a track that, Justin Lin, who was chief economist here at the World Bank, coming from China, has suggested to focus on their latent comparative advantage, where they can look at value chains and invest in those. And Afri-Exim Bank is trying to encourage industrial clusters and parks at subnational levels, and is providing them support to make that happen. In all of this, infrastructure is critical. And even more importantly, if Africa's play in international trade is to grow, at the moment, barely 3% of international trade, and this is where real growth takes place, trade. If those policies can provide opportunity for aggregating across boundaries, it means that a significant investment in infrastructure to make that aggregating across boundaries possible, that can lead to significant growth in Africa's play in international trade. And this is where we must focus policy and ensure that the private sector works closely with the public sector. In fact, I have a running mantra that we need a tripartite approach to development. And then there was actually a conference in Nairobi in 1985, was sponsored by the Aga Khan Foundation, to take a tripartite approach to development where the private sector, the public sector, and what they called back in those days PDAs, private development agencies, the social enterprise sector, can collaborate in such a manner that each sector drives what is more effective at doing with a clear common goal of development. And I think that this kind of philosophy will help where we should be traveling to.
Okay. So you've spoken about Afri-Exim Bank, but I wonder if you could talk more about, and you also talked about, the perceived risk of investment at the subnational level. Wonder if you could talk more about this perceived risk and real risk in investment in infrastructure development at the subnational level in Africa, and if sovereign wealth funds could be seen as a tool that can help in de-risking private investment in infrastructure development, and not only investment that might be driven from the continent, but thinking about the US and other international actors, how sovereign wealth funds could possibly be seen as a tool to help de-risk private investment in infrastructure development.
One of the big challenges on the continent is accountability. A lot of effort is put into trying to hold national government accountable. Sometimes not very successful, but there's very little that is done regarding subnational level accountability. And a good part of the resources that get filtered away happen at the subnational level. Now, if the idea of a sovereign wealth fund brings more discipline into the thinking at the subnational level, and part of what that does is that it will enable those who are trying to facilitate the risking. Because you see, risk is a matter of perception. If you're here in Washington, you don't know what is going on out there. There's an assumption that you're dealing with a bunch of bandits. I think that many years ago, one of our development scholars, I think from out of Harvard, actually wrote a book, Tropical Gangsters. Kids Guide. I think it's the Tropical Gangsters. So a perception that you're dealing with a bunch of tropical gangsters determines how you price a facility, for example, that is going in there. But if the discipline of a sovereign wealth fund that is well managed is part of this international movement of sovereign wealth funds, respect Santiago rules and all of this, it brings more confidence. And so subnationals can then access capital at more competitively priced rate and help development. And again, one of the points that I'd like to make around this is that in many parts of the world, at least in some parts of the world, infrastructure was significantly provided by the private sector. If you go to Australia, most of what is public infrastructure, railroads and all of those, were actually provided by the mining companies. Mm-hmm. They became public later. But you look at the vast natural resources in Africa, and private companies, the mining companies, are not providing that infrastructure as they did, for example, in Australia. It shows that there is a certain perception of risk that is problematic here. And how do we work through that? I think that as more conversations of this nature take place, as roles played by the likes of the multilaterals on the continent increase, the perception of risk may. And a couple of years ago, I was a guest of the government of Australia, traveling around the continent as it is, and I visited the G20 infrastructure hub in Melbourne. And part of the reason that they were set up was that they go in and help advise local infrastructure regulatory agencies on how to facilitate private investment in infrastructure in their countries. They told me they were very disappointed in trying to deal with some of the agencies in Africa who did not show enough interest or understanding of the fact that a good deal of infrastructure comes now from private sector provisioning. I joked about visiting the Philippines, in 1998. The joke was the Philippines is a sick man of Asia, but I nearly went deaf because of all the banging away at, construction around. And I said, wow, this sick man managed to find some money. It's almost all private capital. And we need to make this to happen in Africa. So I think that the possibilities are tremendous. We can take advantage of the moment.
Thank you so much. Just want to let the audience know we can start getting our questions ready now. There are several questions that have come from some of the thoughts that you've laid out, Prof. But before I turn to the audience for questions, I really want to address the elephant in the room when it comes to sovereign wealth funds, and that's the question of governance. Ultimately, at the end of the day, these funds are going to be managed by the government. And so for many, it's, I guess, that risk of just the lack of sustainability or continuity, there is a concern, and a real concern too as well, that many have. So what are some ideas that you could propose or recommendations when we look at sovereign wealth funds and how this could be managed by different governments to ensure sustainability?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the first things that those who set up such funds should think about is of governance systems that essentially make the people the owners. The agency function is a challenge one in post-colonial Africa. But there is a structure of governance in which elements in society, again, it comes back to my tripartite approach, whether it's from social enterprise, private sector, with enough balance that you have checks, balances in how the governance takes place, but very importantly, that the very philosophy of the Sovereign Wealth Fund is anchored on some clear philosophy of the future, of where we can go with sustainable development performance. I give an example. About 24, 25 years ago, talking about East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Philippines. I was visiting the Philippines, and I was at the University of Asia and the Pacific, as it's now known. And I found that they had a monthly business dinner with leaders of business, which they bring private sector, public sector people together. And I thought it was a good idea. So I I borrowed from that idea, I stole it, as they say, and started at the Lagos Business School a monthly breakfast briefing session. I think that this bears mentioning. One U.S. ambassador arrived in Nigeria back in the 90s or early 2000s. And I run into him somewhere and he says, "Oh, you're Patu Tomi. You were in my handover notes." And I thought, oh my God, I'm in trouble now. I'm in the handover notes of ambassadors? He says, yes, my predecessor left a note that the breakfast briefing session in the Lagos Business School is a must attend. It is the only event in Nigeria that starts on time and ends on time. So, anyhow, the briefing breakfast session that I took away from the Philippines, of course, changed its tune, was designed to provide part of that. Somebody wanted me about something.
Those handover notes.
So this meeting was designed to provide a context that, people who are really pillars of the economy can engage in. And so at one of them I was projecting what we should be doing. I normally made a 5-minute comment. So the program was 1 hour, split 1 hour every first Tuesday of the month. And in that projection, and that day the guest was the IMF country director. And I said, Nigeria should not take in more than $30 a barrel revenue from crude oil into its distributable pool fund, the FAC account, as we call it in Nigeria. Everything above that, up till $50, should go to a stabilization fund, so that if oil prices drop to $8, $9 as they did in 1998, you could keep the budget running on $30 without a break, because you can draw from the stabilization fund. That everything above 50 should go to a future fund, so-called sovereign wealth fund. And the IMF gentleman said, well, we're thinking like that. You don't need me in Abuja. People should be able to take these kinds of advice and work from it. But what was interesting was when I was making those proposals, the state governors were very upset, very, very upset with me. I was part of the team that put some of the policy framework for the government of Lagos at the time in place. And the Commissioner for Finance, who's Minister of Finance today, came to me and said, how can you be encouraging them to take our money? That's taking away the money of the states. And I said to him, Wale, come on. You should know that it's like a mutual fund. Lagos State's proportion in that saved money will always be. And if you can draw on the fact that you have that reserve, you can use it to strengthen your capacity to actually borrow. If you can implement the money that you've borrowed in such a way that it will allow growth, it will strengthen your financial system. And he kind of like, okay, but they're taking our money. Now, had President Obasanjo not responded to those pressures and created the so-called excess crude account, Nigeria would have run into a lot of trouble in 2008 when the global financial crisis hit. That excess crude account was significant buffer for Nigeria. Now, if we can take philosophy like that and institutionalize it in the thinking around the creation of sovereign wealth funds and in defining of people who play governance roles. Perhaps that philosophy can drive some stability in the system and help sovereign wealth funds to be a major anchor for discipline in executing development growth strategies.
Thank you so much, Prof. You've taken us down a history lane and brought up examples to address some of the questions and thoughts that we have around sovereign wealth funds and their utility at the subnational level. I want to turn it over to the audience now, see if we have any questions from the audience. Questions or comments. If you have a question, my colleagues are on the sides with microphones. Identify yourself and your affiliation and then ask your question. And please, I ask that you keep it to a question, brief question. Thank you very much. There's one question at the back over there. Can you hold on? Let's take the gentleman at the back first. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Emeka Ukemjika, and I'm with NOR TV. Prof. Valtomi, can you kindly speak to ability of sovereign wealth funds to exit out of investments in Africa as it relates to liquidity issues when that happens?
Thank you very much. We'll take that question first. While you're taking your notes, then let's take the second question as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Samuel Leah. I'm a current graduate of Towson University, and my grandfather was an Eze from MBC. My question is, based on your understanding, how could Nigeria get rid of corruption when it's from the top to the very bottom? What would be the cure?
Prof, do you want to take those two questions before we do another round?
All right. Now, liquidity is such an important part of the challenge in managing a sovereign wealth fund. And again, the skills of the managers really important in this regard. When managers are not skilled enough, they can run into liquidity problems. And this is why meetings such as Brown Capital have created will help in peer strengthening one another in the necessary skills for managing sovereign wealth funds. Because it is given to conservative, if you will, approaches to preserve, secure that future, it is very easy to run into a liquidity challenge in terms of the investments that they go into. But I do think that if they are funded appropriately and the managers are skilled enough, they can deal with those issues of liquidity a lot better. I think that part of the challenge that most of these funds may face is that the tendency to appoint cronies to run government agencies will lead us to having people not appropriately skilled for managing those challenges. And that's really what we have to watch. And that's part of the whole governance apparatus thing. You know, those in the governance process must be able to insist that those who are appointed to run these agencies have enough skills to manage them well. Unfortunately, what has happened at the Nigeria experience is probably the most telling. Today in Nigeria, people don't believe that you need any skills to do anything. Just get appointed. You know, if anything that happens, this new government, appointment. Everybody's talking about appointment. Do you have capacity to deal? What is capacity? Just appoint me. So we need to really manage that if we're going to go anywhere in these matters. Okay.
The gentleman had the question on corruption. How to?
Oh, yes, corruption. Yes, the big elephant in the room. I have mantra that has it's coming out of my nose, ears, everybody around me has heard this 1,000 times. Values shape human progress. People make light of the cost of corruption. It is very, very costly for any society, extremely so. You cannot predict the outcome of a transaction if people can, in a discretionary manner, act any which way. It therefore just balloons the risk. And so managing corruption, I mean, one of the things that I get beat up on quite a bit is that I somehow suggested that General Buhari may make a good president. And all I said was, if all he does is stop corruption, because he made a lot about corruption, if all he does maybe is better than, we didn't have much of an option anyway. But sadly, the Buhari regime turned out to be perhaps the most corrupt in Nigerian history, in my view. So corruption matters. And corruption is not just about catching the thief. Corruption is about systems that even prevent you from thinking about being corrupt. It's about committed citizenship that says, no, you can't do that and get away with it. And so people are blowing whistles all over the place. But very importantly, it's about ensuring that people are not led into temptation. What do I mean by people being led into temptation? If you pay a policeman a wage that doesn't actually take him from the office home, and you give him a uniform, you're giving him the right to bully anybody that comes by his way. And so he extorts. And so, part of our teaching, because at the Lagos Business School, ethics is central. Whatever it is you study, ethics is central. And so people come and say, look, but these guys, this is extortion. It's like a man puts a gun to your head and says, your money or your life. You say, I don't believe in giving people what does not belong to them. So shoot me. So we have to create the conditions that makes it easier. And I, one of the reasons that I enjoyed reading the book, The Fix. It was about how countries dealt with peculiarly challenging problems. How did Singapore get rid of corruption? I've traveled quite a bit in Hong Kong. Why did the Hong Kong police go from being a very corrupt police force to being an amazing police force? And I believe that there is enough example that we can implement to reduce corruption anywhere in the world, including in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Prof. Oh, okay, so we have quite a number of, okay. So let's take this two here first. The two here first, the gentleman here and the gentleman with the hat, and then we'll come back for the next round of questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Matt Mogeku. I'm a retired professor of journalism. I just have a quick question for my brother, Pat. It's two in one, so pardon me. Whenever I hear about wealth, what comes to my mind is access to that wealth. And what comes to my mind after that is the differential access to that wealth. And what finally comes to my mind after that is conflict. Because there's differential access, whether it is sovereign wealth or any wealth at all that is supposed to be for the people, there's differential access. what do we put into this establishment of sovereign wealth that will reduce the tendency for conflict? And the second part is, I know you were first a journalist before you became a political economist. I'm into peace journalism now. What do we do as journalists where we have conflict from these areas to try to mediate and bring about peace in that conflict area? Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Prof. Those were two questions in one. Do you want to go ahead and take those two first before we go to the next round?
Well, thank you. One of the things that fascinate me, Matt and I were colleagues in grad school at Indiana back in the late 1970s. One of the things that fascinate me about the American example is the fact of opportunity and access and conflict. I find that part of the reason that, in spite of everything, I mean, it's not a perfect society, conflict is reduced in America is that opportunity beckons. You really, I mean, challenges have been changing. Talking about journalism, I told a story. When I first came to go to grad school here in 1978, I mean, we were lucky if we had a friend who could make some money driving a taxi. It was, it was and the first warning I got arriving in Indianapolis to be careful of Martinsville and driving through there. But I come to visit, and I'm in Chicago, and I'm watching television, and I'm not sure I'm in Lagos or Chicago, because the anchor has a Nigerian name, and all of that. Access, opening up opportunity to people for the interests of all, not because you love or hate them. Because I think that the reason access is open is this is talent, the economy needs talent, and those people grow. And this is what has changed in the 40-something odd years since we were in grad school here in the United States. So this, I believe, tends to reduce conflict when people can hope, aspire, and actually achieve what they aspire to. I think that for sovereign wealth funds, the challenge is really in how people perceive that it helps open opportunity for all. And again, trip a little bit on this. A couple of years, two Columbia University economists, Abin Subramanian and Salai Martin, wrote an IMF working paper, I think it was about 2003, that basically Nigeria would be better off if we didn't have a government. That if you just collected the revenues coming from oil and sent out checks to everybody, the welfare outcome would be greater than what government did with those resources. That created an approach to distributing revenues from mineral resources. So it's actually done here in the United States. Alaska, certain month in the year, everybody gets a check from the government. Alberta in Canada, and so on and so forth. So I invited a gentleman who had a variant of that thought. He was then working out of Kennedy school, I think, at Harvard, but later came to Columbia, and now he's an editor in London's Norwegian, Martin Sambu. I invited Martin to Lagos and put him on television. By the way, one of the many things I do is run a television. I host a television show in Nigeria, which, again, I borrow a lot. I borrowed from here, Capital Gang, and converted it to a show in Nigeria called Patito's Gang. So I brought Martin to Lagos and put him on Patito's Gang. And Martin's argument was that, Nigerians don't worry about how their oil money is spent because they don't know it's their money. That what should be done in Nigeria is that should essentially send out a small amount of money, maybe $10 to every citizen, and say, this is your share of oil revenues. We've taxed you already at 92%. So this is what is left after the tax. And that people will go, so this is our money they're spending. And that the effect will be completely different. So I think that the conflict that comes from perception of ownership. If they don't know that is their monies, what will they? So anyway, journalists and peace. Actually been beating up on Nigerian journalists recently. Was in Nigeria 2 weeks ago, and I recorded a show in which I basically worried about the fact that we've lost what used to be called development journalism. Not just peace, development journalism. Part of the effect of corruption, state capture, and all of that is that the media seems to be available to be bought. And so journalism is not playing that role that we idealized that it should play. In that episode, I reminded people that as a 21-year-old youth copper, I actually forced the cabinet reshuffle in Nigeria from my writing, the so-called Radio Kaduna controversy, and Obasanjo. But young reporters don't even think they have that kind of responsibility anymore. Everybody's in celebrity journalism. You, the reporter, as a celebrity, column writing and all of that. So, peace journalism. Please come back home and teach us a few things about that.
Thank you so much, Prof. Okay, there were 1, 2, 4 more questions in the room, so let's take the gentleman in front with the hat.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask, I forgot to make this announcement at the top of the hour, but please silence your phones if you haven't done so already, because we've had a couple of phones go off.
Okay, thank you. My name is Emmanuel Emenyono. I came in this morning from Connecticut. Oftentimes, the idea of sovereign wealth fund to finance infrastructure in Africa is being noised about. But if you look at the African Sovereign Fund, from the Pula Fund, the Botswana Fund, to the Libya and the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Fund, altogether, if you add them all up, they are not up to like $20 billion or anything like that. So my question then is, how can African governments interest the wealthier sovereign funds like the Norwegian and Kuwait and so on to invest in infrastructure in Africa? What are kind of some of the impediments in attracting those funds? Finally, I learned from the then Assistant Secretary of Commerce Department in charge of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, towards the twilight of the Obama administration, that they were setting up about $2 trillion of fund to fast-track infrastructure development in Africa. Do you know whether there are any other regions of the world that has that kind of initiative? And if at all anything came of the Obama-era initiative? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. While you're thinking on that, we can take this question in front. Niat, let's take a question from the gentleman in front over here.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm Ghias Naqshbandi from American University in Washington, D.C. We have been hosting Sovereign Wealth Fund for the last 10 years, and we do that every year. We just published a handbook about Sovereign Wealth Fund. What I don't understand over the years, just to put some numbers for the audience, that the Sovereign Wealth Fund, you are talking about $12 trillion plus minus. We have 150 sovereign wealth funds. What I don't understand, that even though I attended the Botswana meeting in the years, but basically the African sovereign wealth fund represent less than 5% of the world. So keeping in mind that the old story that you have to have a natural resources in order to have sovereign wealth fund is gone out of the window years ago. And the best example that I can give you is the question of the state of Djibouti. They have their own sovereign wealth fund. So my question to you, what forces that will encourage the formation of sovereign wealth funds in Africa, which is rich in human resources, natural resources, talent, and what have you? This is really puzzling me over the last 40 years. I worked for the oldest sovereign wealth fund in the world, Kuwait Investment Authority. Don't ask me when, because I will not answer that question.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you. I think that the first question on the size of African sovereign wealth funds being so small and what can be done to get the bigger funds to support infrastructure development in Africa. I think Professor Mayonu was referring to Mathmuri and the work that was done here in Washington around that. We're trying to catch up on where things are in that. I mean, also during the Obama era, there was the Lighting Up Africa initiative. Somehow, politics has its shifting appetite, and that tends to affect and influence what gets done. I think that the United States can provide significant leadership, and I hear that some things are popping up in some areas in conversation in policy arena at this time, but I have not seen a strong drive building up on what the then, I think, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Matthew Murray and his colleagues were working on. Again, one needs to build a coalition of the interested to try and perhaps create a narrative that increases a sense of urgency around those. I think that what has happened, unfortunately, and Ambassador McGreen was hinting at it, I think, in his remarks, is that as efforts have shifted more and more towards humanitarian assistance in a world that is full of tragedies right now, development assistance is suffering. And so keen initiatives like those and in getting the kind of value that they should bring has not managed to gain the traction that it should. But this is a very short-sighted thing. I mean, let us look at our planet and look at where it is going to be able to assess the reasonableness of helping get infrastructure going in Africa. Africa is a very young continent in an aging world. Africa is a huge, vast, open territory of all kinds of opportunity. A great deal of where this planet will be looking 50 years from now will be rooted in Africa. Is it not wisdom to actually work to ensure that the possibilities flower in a way that benefits the whole planet today? And so this is part of what I think is happening with the dominant narrative. I had the pleasure a few weeks ago of being at a meeting. I think it was a Brookings initiative on China in the US. And there was some frustration at that meeting about the narrative that drives China-US relations and the fact that the nature of domestic politics can somehow push people into corners and tensions that should not probably reflect the realities that different kind of relationship would engender. And I made a small contribution, which is that, again, turning to this, politics is politics. The reality of what politics will create is there. You can't help it. The politician who wants to sound tough on China in the US, you know, he has to respond to those so-called domestic pressures. But what is academia, knowledgeable civil society doing to shape a different narrative and make that available? Maybe it's the same thing with Africa. Mm-hmm. I do not think that there is enough work by social enterprise, intellectual sector to create a narrative on Africa that actually serves the US greater long-term interest. Mm-hmm. And this is a big challenge, and we have to work at that.
Okay, so, Prof, on that point, to the question on what could be the force, as you said, the gentleman in front said,
okay.
Sovereign wealth funds on the continent.
Well, I think that the key is good governance. You've got to have political leaders who understand that sovereign wealth funds can be an important tool of management. I think that right now, many of the political actors are limited in their understanding of wealth creation to start with. They are focused more on power and the benefits of capture, state capture. And so a new kind of politics, and it's got to fall to the citizens. What are citizens doing? What's the diaspora doing? I think that a very critical role for change in Africa is that of the diaspora. And if you look at the last century, Japan, post-Meiji restoration, the role of the diaspora from Germany particularly, and then you look at India rising, China rising. I think that the African diaspora needs to do a lot more to shape the way the continent makes its choices. And this is something that we need to really hang on to.
Thank you, sir. So we have one last question in the back. Oh, two questions. So let's take the gentleman first, and then we'll come to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Sampong. I'm a recent graduate from Johns Hopkins, SAIS. My question borders on governance. I think that's the the big elephant in the room. And specifically, I want to talk about the abuse of the sovereign wealth funds in Africa and the need to ring fence it. If you look at what is going on in Africa right now, we have not less than 20 African countries in debt crisis because basically we have been funding our infrastructure with debt and it's not sustainable. So my question is, do you think a constitutional amendment it's kind of a plausible way, or Africa should move past just creating these sovereign wealth funds with act of parliament and maybe enshrine them in the constitution? For example, in Nigeria, 5 years ago, IMF Fiscal Monitor ranked Nigeria as the second worst user of sovereign wealth funds. In Ghana, a government wanted to divert part of the minerals income into as a collateral for debt. You know, there's been so much abuse. That is why the professor said that, you see, if you look at the size of our sovereign funds, it's not growing. So do you think African countries should look to enshrining the provisions, the governance of these funds into the constitution so that it prevents successive government from abusing it? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let's take your question over here.
Good afternoon, Professor. I'm Nema Bird. I'm working with the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. My question would be, in terms of prioritization of these sovereign wealth funds capital, could you talk about focusing on investing in the private sector players, so the manufacturers, the construction companies, the service providers that would actually implement these infrastructure goals?
Okay. Well, you know, there's a sense in which sometimes in Africa we think that every problem will be fixed by a constitution. Constitutions are living documents. Again, if you don't mind my saying, it's one of my great fascinations with the United States Constitution is how small it is. And it's been around for so long, and with so few amendments. I like to say that I once challenged the thinking of somebody whose work I generally respect, Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson is the English, not British, he's not English, he's I think Scottish, British historian who wrote the book Civilization, the West versus the Rest, 6 Killer Apps of Western Power. He makes a statement that the making of the US Constitution is probably the greatest effort in institution building in human history. I thought, that's too generalized, a historian should not make these kinds of statements. After many years, I came back to agreeing with Ferguson that he was probably quite right. And the truth of the matter is that the Constitution is as good as the people who implement the Constitution. Mm-hmm. You can write anything you want into a Constitution. The people want to throw the thing away, they will throw it and do whatever they want to do. There are countries that have so-called unwritten constitutions, set of conventions shape the way that they act, and they tend to act appropriately. So I think that what matters is trying to build a culture that supports a certain way of thinking and acting. And if the people who own the culture, they will hold people who go into public life accountable for how that culture is lived. And so I think that sovereign wealth funds will thrive from how well we educate people about the values that they bring and how those people ultimately hold governments accountable. On the question about investing in the private sector. I do believe that is very important. The private sector is so important. One of the big excuses that African politicians give is that the private sector is too weak to really determine anything. That is why government must step in. Now, I'm not one of those laissez-faire guys that say government has no place, they just do everything in private sector. No, there is a place for government. In fact, I remember during the conversations on structural adjustment programs, when they were starting in the mid-80s, there was a group of researchers from Columbia, Princeton, and somewhere else who tried to bring together African academics and African policymakers. I think they got a finance minister and one academic or so from each country. And we all converged in Nairobi. Kalu Idika Kalu came as finance minister from Nigeria. And the one thing that everybody agreed to was that structural adjustment may mean smaller government, but it will mean stronger government. Because there is such an important role in certain areas for government. However, not having a strong private sector and investing in them is a major weakness. And therefore, every effort to build up the private sector, to be a private sector. I mean, I'm very, years ago, I actually wrote a book titled Business Angel as a Missionary. And the point of that book was to talk about the role in creating startups and all of that. And somehow, one of the things that I suggested is that there are many people who say they're private sector in Africa, but they're just people who eat off the hands of government. And they're not really private sector actors. They just rent champions who are connected up to people in power. I'm not probably the biggest high life music fan, but I came to admire very much a remark by a Ghanaian high life music performer called Ben Bracco. I mean, he had enough wisdom to say that any country where the politicians are richer than the businessmen, it's a country that's about to collapse. And the truth is that we need to build up the private sector because it does provide creative, independent action that can help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Still have, well, I can take just one more question. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Edward Ilechukwu. I run a non-for-profit in New York that advocates for the education of the girl child in Africa. I must say that I've really enjoyed this discussion, but I'm looking at how we can bring it to a bigger platform. Take, for instance, how does the African Union, how can we bring the African Union into this discussion? I mean, the African Union has an ambassador to the United States. And I would think that African economies, which are being run by presidents in Africa, we have to start thinking of a way to get them involved in this kind of discussion. So, Prof, if you can call it a suggestion, even Oge, to get involved, the African Union here in Washington, maybe send an invitation, have a bigger platform to discuss it, and that way, even if we're not sure that the presidents, of these economies in Africa are going to buy into this kind of discussions, but, some way, somehow, we might be able to, get some interest from a few of them that are interested in, stuff like this. Thank you.
If I could just chime in there, just thank you so much for that comment. Actually, with the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, we work very closely with the African Diplomatic Corps here in DC. So the ambassadors and representatives from the different embassies actually engage in our conversations. And the AU ambassador is probably tuning in online for this discussion, but she's also aware that these conversations are happening. So we maintain a very, very close relationship with the African Diplomatic Corps. They're actually one of our biggest supporters on these conversations.
Okay. Without stealing Oge's thunder, I think one of the marching orders I have from her is to work on this conference. And I have secured the participation of 2 former African heads of state.
Well, we won't talk about
We won't
that.
talk about that.
We won't let that out.
Oh, okay. Okay, so. But,
Thank you.
But part of the work that PathTrack does is essentially around that. And so we have a path to the Summit of Heads of States through the office of the Commissioner for Trade and Investment, Ambassador Machunga. And I'm actually supposed to go to the AU Summit in Accra in July to make a presentation, for PathTrack as part of that whole. But yeah, I think that it's important to engage more with them, and I hope that will make a difference.
Sir, we are now at time. I apologize. I cannot take any more questions, but I'm sure that we might have a few minutes afterwards, maybe to chit-chat in the hallway, but I apologize. I can't take any more questions. So, Prophet Tomi, I want to thank you so much for your participation in this conversation, and I am delighted that we will have you here at the Wilson Center with us for the next 12 months as we dive into this conversation on sovereign wealth funds and bring back some of the actors that engaged with us a few years ago on this conversation. I think there is so much that you've given us to think about as we move forward, and really thinking about how this plays out at the subnational level. Because as you pointed out in your comments, some of the greatest foreign policy challenges that we'll face in the future moving forward will really play out at the subnational level, at the city level. How are governments equipped to really handle this effectively? So please, everyone, join me in thanking Prof for this. And I'd also encourage you all to please check out our website, the Wilson Center website, the Africa Program section, for information on the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, as well as publications that we've had over time on different discussions we've had and on sovereign wealth funds as well. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of your day.